I stood there, an unwanted shadow in a room full of light, clutching a glass I wished I didn't have to raise. When my daughter whispered, "Don't ruin this for us," I felt every bit the ghost they pretended I was. The words cut deeper than any blade ever could. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and at 73, I've learned that sometimes the people who should love you most are the ones who hurt you deepest. That morning started like any other in my cramped studio apartment on East 84th Street in Manhattan. The radiator clanked its familiar tune, competing with the distant rumble of the subway beneath my feet. I could smell the stale coffee from yesterday's cup, still sitting on my tiny kitchen counter next to a stack of unpaid medical bills. I was exhausted. Not the kind of tired that comes from physical work, but the bone-deep weariness that settles in your soul when you've spent decades trying to earn love that should have been freely given. The wedding invitation lay on my nightstand, its gold edges catching the gray morning light filtering through my single window. My granddaughter Emma's wedding. The first family event I'd been invited to in over 2 years. I remember touching that invitation with trembling fingers, reading my name written in elegant script. For a moment, hope bloomed in my chest like a flower breaking through concrete. Maybe this would be different. Maybe they remembered I existed. Maybe they still loved me. How foolish I was. The memories came flooding back as I held that card. Emma as a little girl, her chubby fingers wrapped around mine as we walked through Central Park on autumn afternoons. The smell of her hair after bath time, sweet and clean. The way she used to call me Grammy Maggie and beg me to read just one more bedtime story. Back then, my house in Queens was filled with laughter and the sound of little feet running up and down the stairs. But that house was gone now, sold to pay for my son-in-law's failed business ventures. My savings, my nest egg, my security, all of it poured into their bottomless pit of needs and wants and emergencies that never seemed to end. And what did I get in return? A studio apartment that felt more like a prison cell, and a family who treated me like an embarrassing secret. I wasn't always this woman they tried to forget. There was a time when I mattered, when my opinion counted for something. I had been a high school English teacher for 35 years, shaping young minds and earning respect from my colleagues and students. I had raised 2 children as a single mother after my husband died of a heart attack when he was only 42. I had been strong, capable, independent, but somewhere along the way, I became invisible. It started small, as these things always do. A missed phone call here, a forgotten birthday there. "We're so busy, Mom," my daughter Linda would say whenever I tried to reach out. "You understand, right?" And I did understand, or I thought I did. Young families have demands, responsibilities. I didn't want to be a burden. So when Linda called crying about losing their house in Westchester, I didn't hesitate. I took out a second mortgage on my own home and handed over $40,000. "It's just temporary, Mom," she promised. "We'll pay you back as soon as Mike's construction company gets back on its feet." That was 8 years ago. When Emma needed money for college, I liquidated my retirement fund. When their son Jake broke his arm and they couldn't afford the medical bills, I emptied my savings account. When they wanted to take a family vacation to Disney World, for the kids' sake, to make memories, Linda explained, I somehow found $2,000 I didn't have. Each time I told myself it was what mothers do. We sacrifice. We give. We love unconditionally, even when that love isn't returned in kind. But love shouldn't feel like a transaction, should it? Love shouldn't leave you feeling emptied out and forgotten. The phone calls became less frequent, then stopped altogether unless they needed something. Holiday invitations dried up. I spent Thanksgiving alone in my apartment, microwaving a sad turkey dinner while I imagined them gathered around a table that no longer had room for me. Christmas was worse. Packages sent to grandchildren I barely saw anymore. Gifts that were acknowledged with impersonal thank you texts if I was lucky. I began to feel like a ghost haunting my own life. The loneliness was crushing. You know that feeling when you're surrounded by 8 million people in New York City but feel completely alone? When you could disappear tomorrow and it might take weeks for anyone to notice? That became my daily reality. I'd ride the subway and watch families together, parents and children chatting and laughing, and I'd wonder what I had done wrong. Where had I failed? But the worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was the slow, creeping realization that I was being used. It happened gradually, like watching water erode a riverbank. A comment here about how I had it easy because I was retired. A suggestion there that since I wasn't working, I could babysit whenever they needed. An expectation that I would always say yes, always give more, always put their needs before my own. "Mom, you don't understand how hard it is," Linda would say when I tried to share my own struggles. "You're retired. You don't have real problems anymore." Real problems. As if watching your life savings disappear wasn't real. As if living on Social Security wasn't real. As if being forgotten by your own children wasn't the most real problem of all. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday in March. I had fallen in my apartment, my arthritis flaring up something terrible. I lay on my kitchen floor for 20 minutes before I could get to my phone and call Linda. The phone rang and rang before going to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached the Wilson family. We can't come to the phone right now, but leave a message and we'll get back to you." I didn't leave a message. What was the point? Instead, I called Mrs. Chen from next door, an 80-year-old woman who barely spoke English but who helped me to my feet and made me tea while I waited for the swelling in my knee to go down. A virtual stranger showed me more kindness in one afternoon than my own family had in months. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that phone ringing in Linda's house, about how easy it was for them to ignore me when I needed them most. I thought about all the times I had dropped everything to help them, racing across the city at a moment's notice whenever they called. The double standard was so glaring, so painful, that I felt physically sick. I started paying attention then, really paying attention to how they treated me versus how they treated each other. When Mike's mother visited from Florida, they rolled out the red carpet. There were dinners out, Broadway shows, shopping trips. When I visited, if I was even invited, I got leftovers reheated in the microwave and a brief hello before they disappeared into their phones or laptops. I noticed that my grandchildren, Emma and Jake, barely acknowledged my presence anymore. They had been coached, I realized, trained to see me as unimportant, irrelevant. Emma, who used to curl up next to me to watch movies, now sat across the room, earbuds in, scrolling through her phone. Jake, who once begged me to play board games with him, acted like I wasn't even there. The evidence was everywhere once I started looking for it. Birthday parties I wasn't invited to. Family photos on social media that I wasn't in. Conversations that stopped when I entered a room. They had created a family without me, and I had somehow missed the memo. But the wedding invitation changed everything. Or so I thought. My name, Margaret Wilson, written in beautiful calligraphy. Not just "and guest" or an afterthought. My actual name. I held on to that invitation like a lifeline, proof that I still mattered, that I was still family. I spent weeks preparing for that wedding. I bought a new dress, the first one I'd purchased for myself in years, a deep blue silk that made my gray eyes look brighter. I got my hair done at a salon in the neighborhood, splurging on highlights that took 10 years off my face. I even bought new shoes, though my feet would pay for it later. I wanted to look perfect. I wanted them to remember why they loved me. I wanted to belong again. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, practicing my smile. I had prepared little stories to share, funny anecdotes about Emma's childhood that would make everyone laugh and remember the good times. I had wrapped my gift carefully, a check for $5,000, money I could barely spare but wanted to give because that's what you do for family. I took the subway to the venue, a beautiful old church in Brooklyn Heights, then a taxi to the reception at a waterfront restaurant in Dumbo. The Manhattan skyline glittered across the East River like something out of a fairy tale. It should have been magical. It should have been perfect. Instead, it became the day I finally learned the truth about my place in their lives. From the moment I walked into the reception, I felt it, that invisible wall that separated me from everyone else. Linda greeted me with a tight smile and a quick hug that felt more like a dismissal than a welcome. "You look nice, Mom," she said, but her eyes were already scanning the room for more important people to talk to. I found my table, table 12, in the back corner near the kitchen doors. Not with family, not even with family friends. I was seated with distant relatives I hadn't seen in years and a few elderly neighbors who looked as confused as I felt about being relegated to the shadows. I watched as Mike's mother was seated at table 2, right next to the head table. I watched as Linda fawned over her other in-laws, making sure they had everything they needed. I watched as my own granddaughter, beautiful in her white gown, greeted every guest with warmth and excitement except for me. When Emma finally made her way to my table, her smile was polite but distant. "Thank you for coming, Grandma," she said, the words feeling rehearsed. "Wouldn't miss it for the world, sweetheart," I replied, reaching out to touch her hand. She pulled back slightly, just enough to make her discomfort clear. "I should go greet the other guests," she said quickly, and she was gone before I could tell her how beautiful she looked or how proud I was of the woman she'd become. I sat there in my beautiful blue dress, surrounded by the sound of laughter and celebration that didn't include me, and realized I was nothing more than an obligation checked off a list. They had invited me because they had to, not because they wanted me there. The speeches began. Mike's best man told hilarious stories about college adventures. Linda gave a tearful tribute to her daughter, talking about watching Emma grow up, about family traditions and love that lasts forever. Mike's parents shared their joy at welcoming Emma into their family. No one mentioned me, not once. 30 years of being Emma's grandmother, of babysitting and birthday parties and bedtime stories, and I was invisible. Again. But the real humiliation came when they played a slideshow of Emma's life. Photo after photo of her childhood, her achievements, her milestones, and I was in exactly 3 pictures out of hundreds. 3. And in those 3, I was barely visible, pushed to the edge of the frame like an afterthought. I recognized pictures I had taken, moments I had captured, but I had been cropped out or hidden behind other people. They had literally erased me from their history. That's when Linda leaned over and whispered those words that shattered what was left of my heart. "Don't ruin this for us." Not, "I'm glad you're here, Mom." Not, "Thank you for everything you've done for our family." Just a warning to stay invisible, to not make waves, to remember my place in the hierarchy of their affection. Have you ever felt that moment when everything becomes crystal clear? When the fog lifts and you see the truth that's been hiding in plain sight? That's what happened to me in that moment. I wasn't a beloved mother and grandmother. I was an embarrassment they were managing. The years of sacrifice suddenly made sense. The isolation, the forgotten birthdays, the ignored phone calls. I hadn't been investing in relationships. I had been buying temporary tolerance. Every dollar I gave them, every boundary I let them cross, every insult I swallowed with a smile, it was all just feeding a machine that consumed my dignity and gave nothing back. I thought about Mrs. Chen, who barely knew me but had shown me more genuine kindness than my own family. I thought about the nurse at my doctor's office who always asked how I was doing and actually listened to the answer. I thought about the woman at the grocery store who helped me carry my bags when my arthritis was flaring up. Strangers treated me with more respect than my own blood. Linda was watching me, her eyes filled with worry that I might actually speak up, might actually claim my space in this family. The fear in her expression told me everything I needed to know about how little she thought of me. And that's when something shifted inside me. Something that had been broken for so long I had forgotten it was there. My spine straightened, my shoulders squared. I felt the ghost of the woman I used to be, the teacher who commanded respect, the single mother who had raised 2 children with strength and dignity. I had spent so many years trying to be small enough to fit into the tiny space they had carved out for me. But I was done being small. I was done being invisible. I was done pretending that their crumbs of affection were enough to sustain me. So when they asked for toasts, when the microphone was passed around the room, I did something I hadn't done in years. I stood up. The room fell silent as I walked to the front, my new shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. I could feel Linda's panic radiating from across the room. I could see Mike shaking his head slightly, trying to discourage me. I could see Emma's face, confused and worried. But for the first time in years, I didn't care what they thought. I was going to speak my truth. I took the microphone with steady hands and looked out at the sea of faces. Most of them didn't even know who I was. I was just some old woman interrupting their good time. "Good evening," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Margaret Wilson, Emma's grandmother. The words hung in the air. I saw Linda start to stand, probably planning to stop me, but Mike pulled her back down. I've been thinking about what to say tonight, I continued, about what wisdom an old woman might offer to a young bride starting her life. And I realized that the most important thing I can share is something I wish I had learned much earlier in life. I paused, looking directly at Linda, then at Emma. You can't buy love, I said simply. You can't earn it through sacrifice or silence. You can't win it by making yourself smaller or quieter or more convenient. Real love doesn't ask you to disappear. Real love doesn't whisper warnings about not ruining things. Real love celebrates your presence instead of managing your visibility. The room was completely silent now. I could hear the confused murmur of people who didn't understand what was happening. Emma, sweetheart, you are starting a marriage, which means you're creating a new family. And I want you to remember that in healthy families, love flows both ways. In healthy families, people show up for each other not just when it's convenient, but especially when it's hard. In healthy families, everyone has a voice that matters. I could see tears in some eyes around the room, but they weren't tears of joy. They were tears of discomfort, of people who recognized themselves in my words. I have given everything I had to give to this family, I continued, my voice beginning to shake slightly. My money, my time, my heart, my dignity. And I convinced myself that this was love, that this was what mothers and grandmothers do. But love isn't supposed to leave you feeling empty and forgotten. Love isn't supposed to cost you your sense of worth. Linda was on her feet now, her face red with embarrassment and anger. Mom, please, no, I said firmly, the word carrying 30 years of swallowed protests. I have been quiet long enough. I have been invisible long enough. I have been grateful for scraps long enough. I turned back to Emma, this young woman I had helped raise but who barely knew me anymore. Sweetheart, I hope your marriage brings you joy. I hope you find the kind of love that lifts you up instead of tearing you down. And I hope you remember that the people who truly love you will never ask you to make yourself smaller, to make them more comfortable. I set the microphone down on the nearest table and walked back toward my purse, retrieving the envelope with the check I had planned to give Emma. $5,000 that represented months of careful budgeting, of skipping meals and turning down the heat to save money. I tore it up. The pieces of paper fluttered to the floor like snow, and I felt something inside me flutter too. Freedom, maybe, or relief, or just the simple satisfaction of finally saying no. I will no longer buy love, I announced to the room, my voice carrying clearly without the microphone. I will no longer accept crumbs and call them a feast. I deserve respect, and if I can't find it here, I'll find it somewhere else. I walked toward the door, my head held high for the first time in years. Behind me, I could hear the chaos erupting. Voices raised in anger and confusion. Linda calling my name, Mike trying to calm people down, Emma crying. But I kept walking. At the door, I turned back one last time. The room was in complete disarray, the beautiful wedding reception destroyed by the truth I had finally spoken. Part of me felt terrible about it. Part of me wondered if I had gone too far, if I had really ruined everything like Linda had been afraid I would. But then I saw something that made it all worthwhile. In the corner, at a table full of teenagers, was Jake, my grandson. He was looking at me with something I hadn't seen in his eyes in years. Respect. He gave me a small nod, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. And I realized that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept loveless treatment. Sometimes the most nurturing thing you can do is stop enabling dysfunction. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do for your family is to demand that they do better. I walked out of that reception hall and into the cool Brooklyn evening air. The Manhattan skyline was still glittering across the water, but it looked different now. It looked like possibility instead of loneliness. I took the subway home to my small apartment, and for the first time in years, the cramped space felt like sanctuary instead of prison. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by my window, watching the city lights twinkle like stars. My phone started ringing almost immediately. Linda, of course, then Mike, then Linda again. I watched their names flash on my screen and made a conscious choice not to answer. For decades, I had always answered when they called. I had always been available. I had always put their needs ahead of my own peace. Not tonight. The voicemails they left were exactly what I expected. Anger first, then guilt. How could you do this to us? You embarrassed our entire family. Everyone was asking what was wrong with you. You ruined Emma's special day. But mixed in with the anger was something else. Panic. Because for the first time in our relationship, I had shown them that I was willing to walk away. For the first time, they realized that their emotional and financial safety net might not always be there. I listened to each message and then deleted them. Their words had no power over me anymore because I had finally learned something crucial. I couldn't control how they treated me, but I could absolutely control how I responded to that treatment. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years. The silence in my apartment didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt peaceful. I made myself a proper breakfast for the first time in months. Eggs and toast and fresh fruit, and ate it slowly, savoring each bite. Then I did something that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. I went shopping. Not for anyone else, not because someone needed something, but just because I wanted to. I bought myself flowers, bright yellow daisies that made me smile. I bought a new book, a mystery novel I'd been wanting to read. I bought myself a nice bottle of wine, not to drown my sorrows, but to celebrate my liberation. Walking through the grocery store, I realized I hadn't shopped for just myself in so long I had forgotten what I actually like to eat. I had been so focused on buying things for family dinners and visits that I had lost track of my own preferences. That afternoon, I called my doctor's office and made appointments for all the checkups I had been putting off because I didn't want to spend money on myself. I scheduled a dentist appointment, an eye exam, even a session with a therapist. For years, I had told myself I couldn't afford these things because I was always giving money to Linda and Mike. But now I realized the truth. I couldn't afford not to take care of myself. The therapy sessions were particularly enlightening. Dr. Rodriguez, a kind woman about my daughter's age, helped me understand the patterns I had fallen into. She explained concepts like emotional manipulation and financial abuse that I had never applied to my own family. She helped me see that love and exploitation often wear the same mask, especially when it comes to aging parents and their adult children. You taught them how to treat you, she said gently during one session, by accepting less than you deserved, by always saying yes, by never setting boundaries. You taught them that you didn't value yourself. But the beautiful thing is, you can teach them differently now. It wasn't easy, learning to value myself after so many years of putting everyone else first. There were days when the loneliness felt crushing, when I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. There were moments when I almost called Linda, almost apologized, almost begged to be let back into their lives on whatever terms they were willing to offer. But then I would remember that night at the wedding, the way Linda had whispered to me like I was a problem to be managed instead of a mother to be celebrated. I would remember how invisible I had felt, how small they had made me become. And I would know that I had made the right choice. About 2 weeks after the wedding, something unexpected happened. Jake called me. Grandma? His voice was different, more mature than I remembered. Jake, how are you, sweetheart? I wanted to tell you something. What you said at the wedding, it made me think about stuff, about how we've been treating you. I held my breath, not wanting to influence whatever he was trying to say. Mom and Dad, they've been telling everyone you had some kind of breakdown or whatever. But I don't think you did. I think you just finally got tired of being treated like crap. The honesty in his young voice brought tears to my eyes. Oh, Jake. No, Grandma. Let me finish. I know we haven't been fair to you. I know you gave us money and stuff, and we just kind of took it without really thinking about what it meant. Emma's been crying ever since the wedding. Not because you ruined it, but because she realized she doesn't really know you anymore. She wants to, though, if you'll let her. This was not the conversation I had expected. For weeks, I had braced myself for more anger, more guilt trips, more attempts to make me feel terrible for speaking my truth. Instead, I was hearing something I had almost given up hope of hearing. Accountability. I would love to get to know Emma better, I said carefully. And you too, Jake. But things can't go back to the way they were. I can't go back to feeling invisible in my own family. I know, he said. I think maybe we all need to figure out how to be better. Not just to you, but to each other. The way you stood up for yourself, it made me realize that I want to be the kind of person who stands up for what's right too. We talked for over an hour that day. Really talked in a way we hadn't since he was little. Jake told me about school, about his dreams of becoming a teacher like I had been, about his girlfriend and his plans for college. I told him about my life too, about the loneliness I had been feeling, and the new things I was discovering about myself. It was the beginning of something new, something neither of us had expected. Emma called a few days later, her voice small and uncertain. Grandma Margaret, I know I probably don't deserve it, but could we get coffee or something? I want to apologize. I want to understand. We met at a little cafe on the Upper West Side, neutral territory where we could talk without the weight of family dynamics pressing down on us. Emma looked so young, so uncertain, nothing like the confident bride she had been just weeks earlier. I've been thinking about what you said at the wedding, she began, stirring her latte nervously, about love not asking you to disappear. And I realized, we did that to you, didn't we? We made you disappear. I reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were cold and trembling. Sweetheart, you were just following the patterns you were taught. We all do that. What matters is recognizing it and choosing to do better. She started crying then, really crying in a way that told me this wasn't manipulation or performance. This was genuine grief. I don't even know you, she whispered. You're my grandmother, you helped raise me, but I don't know your favorite color, or what books you like, or what you wanted to be when you were my age. We turned you into this utility instead of a person. How do we fix that? It was a good question, and I didn't have easy answers. But I knew it started with honesty, with time, with actually seeing each other as whole people instead of roles to be played. We start small, I said. We start with coffee dates like this one. We start with real conversations. We start with respect. Over the following months, something beautiful began to grow. Emma and I started meeting regularly, sometimes just for coffee, sometimes to go to museums or walk through Central Park. She asked me about my childhood, about my marriage to her grandfather, about my years as a teacher. I learned about her hopes and fears, her new marriage, her dreams for the future. Jake and I began what we called grandmother school, where he would come to my apartment one afternoon a week, and I would teach him to cook family recipes while we talked about life. He was fascinated by stories of my teaching career, of the students I had influenced, and the changes I had witnessed in education over the decades. But the real challenge was Linda and Mike. They were furious with me for what they saw as my betrayal at the wedding. More than that, they were terrified. For the first time in our relationship, they couldn't control me, couldn't predict my behavior, couldn't count on my automatic compliance with their wishes. The financial reality hit them quickly. Without my regular gifts and bailouts, they had to actually budget their money. They had to make hard choices about spending. They had to live within their means for the first time in years. Mike's construction business, it turned out, had been failing for quite some time. They had been using my money to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford, to keep up appearances while their foundations crumbled. Without my financial support, they were forced to face the truth about their situation. Linda called me about 3 months after the wedding, her voice different than I had ever heard it. Smaller, more uncertain. Mom, could we talk? We met at the same cafe where Emma and I had begun rebuilding our relationship. Linda looked exhausted, older than her 48 years, worn down by the weight of financial stress and the realization that her safety net was gone. I don't know how to do this, she said without preamble. I don't know how to have a relationship with you that isn't about what you can do for us. It was perhaps the most honest thing she had ever said to me. That's a start, I replied. Recognizing the pattern is the first step to changing it. She started crying then, not the manipulative tears I had seen so many times before, but the genuine tears of someone who had finally hit rock bottom. I turned into someone I don't like, she whispered. I turned into someone who uses people, who uses her own mother. How did I become that person? I had been asking myself the same question about how I had become someone who allowed herself to be used. The answers weren't simple, but they were there if you were willing to look for them. We both learned unhealthy patterns, I said gently. You learned that love meant getting what you needed from me. I learned that love meant giving until it hurt. Neither of those things is actually love. They're just dysfunction wearing love's costume. The conversation that followed was perhaps the most difficult of my life. Linda had to face the reality of how she had treated me, how she had taught her children to treat me, how she had prioritized my money over my dignity. I had to face how I had enabled that treatment, how my desperate need to feel needed had made me complicit in my own devaluation. But difficult conversations are often the most necessary ones. I want to do better, Linda said finally. I want us to have a real relationship, but I don't know how. I've forgotten how to think of you as a person instead of just mom who fixes things. Then we learn together, I said. Just like I'm learning with Emma and Jake. We start small. We start honest. The rebuilding process was slow and sometimes painful. There were setbacks, moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves. Linda would call with a crisis that somehow required money to solve, then catch herself and apologize. I would start to offer financial help, then remember my boundaries and suggest other solutions instead. Mike was the hardest to reach. His pride was wounded by the reality that his business was failing, that he couldn't provide for his family the way he thought he should. He saw my withdrawal of financial support as abandonment rather than boundary setting, and it took months for him to understand the difference. But gradually, something shifted. Without the constant undercurrent of financial manipulation, we began to rediscover each other as people. Linda started asking about my life, my health, my interests. She began to understand that I had an interior life beyond my role as the family bank. The children's attitudes changed too. When they realized that their grandmother was a person with her own feelings and needs, they began to treat me differently. Jake started calling just to chat, not because he needed something. Emma began including me in decisions, asking for my advice on things that mattered to her. It wasn't perfect. Healing never is. There were still moments of tension, still times when someone slipped back into old patterns, but there was also something that hadn't existed before: mutual respect. One evening, about 6 months after the wedding, Linda surprised me with a phone call. "Mom, I just wanted to say thank you." "For what, sweetheart?" "For standing up for yourself, for teaching us that we had to do better. I know it was hard for you, and I know we made it harder. But we're better people now because you demanded that we be." Hearing those words from my daughter, knowing that she finally understood what I had been trying to achieve, was worth every lonely night I had spent wondering if I had made the right choice. That Christmas was different from any we had shared in years. For the first time in a long time, I was invited not because they needed something from me or because obligation demanded it, but because they genuinely wanted me there. We gathered at Emma and her husband David's new apartment, a modest place they could actually afford without help from anyone. The tree was smaller, the gifts were fewer, but the warmth in that room was real in a way it hadn't been for years. Jake had made dinner, using recipes I had taught him during our grandmother school sessions. Emma had created a photo album filled with pictures of our coffee dates and museum visits, documenting the rebuilding of our relationship. Linda had written me a letter, 3 pages of her own handwriting, apologizing for the years of taking me for granted and promising to do better. But the gift that meant the most to me was the simplest one. Mike, my son-in-law who had barely spoken to me in months, stood up before dinner and said, "Margaret, I want to thank you for teaching us what real love looks like. It's not about what you can give or what you can do. It's about showing up, being present, treating each other with respect." We forgot that for a while, but we remember now. The man who had once seen me only as a source of financial support was finally seeing me as a person worthy of respect. It was a miracle I had never expected to witness. As I looked around that table at the faces of my family, my real family, not the people who had used me, but the people who had chosen to love me properly, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: belonging. But the most important relationship I rebuilt during that time was the one with myself. Through therapy, through the quiet hours in my apartment, through the simple act of putting my own needs first for the first time in decades, I rediscovered who Margaret Wilson was when she wasn't trying to please everyone else. I enrolled in an art class at the community center, something I had always wanted to do but never had time for because I was always available to babysit or help with some crisis. I discovered I had a talent for watercolors, especially landscapes. There was something soothing about capturing light and shadow on paper, about creating beauty that belonged entirely to me. I joined a book club at the local library, where 12 women my age gathered monthly to discuss literature and, inevitably, life. These women became my friends in a way I hadn't experienced since my teaching days. They knew me as Margaret the reader, Margaret the painter, Margaret the woman with interesting opinions about novels and politics and life. They didn't know me as someone's mother or grandmother or ATM, just as myself. I started traveling, taking small trips on my own for the first time in my life. A weekend in Boston to see the museums, a week in Vermont during fall foliage season. Nothing extravagant, but adventures that belonged entirely to me. I learned that I loved staying in small bed and breakfasts, that I was braver than I thought about navigating new places, that solitude could be companionship when you actually enjoyed your own company. Most importantly, I learned to say no without guilt. When Linda called asking if I could babysit on short notice, I said no if I had other plans, and I didn't apologize for it. When Emma asked if I could help with wedding expenses for a friend, I explained that my budget didn't allow for it, and I didn't feel bad about having boundaries. Setting boundaries felt strange at first, like speaking a foreign language. But gradually, it became natural. I realized that saying no to things that drained me meant I could say yes to things that fulfilled me. I had energy for my art classes because I wasn't exhausted from being everyone's emergency contact. I had money for small luxuries because I wasn't funding other people's lifestyle choices. The woman who had felt invisible for so many years was finally coming back into focus, even to herself. 1 year after the wedding, Emma called with news that brought both joy and a test of how far we had all come. "Grandma Margaret, I'm pregnant." My first instinct was the old Margaret, to immediately offer money, to volunteer to drop everything to help, to make myself indispensable in this new phase of their lives. But I caught myself. "That's wonderful news, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" We talked about her excitement, her fears, her hopes for this new life she was carrying, and then she said something that told me how much our family had truly changed. "I want this baby to know you, really know you. Not just as someone who gives gifts or babysits, but as the amazing woman you are. I want to tell them stories about your teaching career, about the students you inspired. I want them to see your paintings and hear about your travels. I want them to know their great-grandmother as a whole person." Tears came to my eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than pain. This grandchild would grow up in a family where love wasn't transactional, where people were valued for who they were rather than what they could provide. This baby would have the gift of a healthy family dynamic that I had fought so hard to create. "I would love that," I said. "And Emma, I'm proud of the mother you're going to be. You've learned things about love that took me 73 years to figure out." The baby was born on a crisp October morning, a little girl they named Margaret Rose. Margaret for me, Rose for Emma's other grandmother. When Emma told me they wanted to name her after me, I cried for an hour. Not because of the honor, though that meant everything, but because I knew this little Margaret would grow up knowing she was valued, respected, loved unconditionally. Holding my great-granddaughter for the first time, I realized that my rebellion at the wedding hadn't destroyed our family. It had saved it. By refusing to accept less than I deserved, I had taught everyone in our family to expect and give better treatment. By demanding respect, I had created space for authentic love to grow. Little Margaret Rose will never know a grandmother who disappears into the background or accepts crumbs of affection. She'll know a great-grandmother who paints and travels and speaks her mind. She'll grow up in a family where love means showing up, not just giving money. She'll learn early what it took me decades to understand, that you have to respect yourself before you can teach others to respect you. 2 years have passed since that wedding reception changed everything. My apartment, the one that used to feel like a prison, has become a sanctuary filled with my artwork, books I chose for myself, and photos from my travels. The silence that once felt oppressive now feels peaceful. Linda and I have lunch once a week, just the two of us. Conversations that center on getting to know each other as adults, rather than playing our old roles of giver and taker. Mike has started his own business, smaller than the old one but sustainable without constant outside investment. They've learned to live within their means, and surprisingly, they're happier for it. Emma and I maintain our tradition of coffee dates, now often pushing little Margaret Rose's stroller through the park as we talk. Jake is in his sophomore year of college, studying education like his great-grandmother did, and he calls me his inspiration. But perhaps the most meaningful change is in how I see myself. When I look in the mirror now, I don't see a burden or an obligation or a woman trying to buy love. I see someone who stood up for herself when it mattered most. I see someone who refused to disappear. I see someone worthy of respect and capable of demanding it. The other day, I was in the grocery store when I overheard a conversation that stopped me in my tracks. A woman about my age was on the phone, clearly distressed. "Yes, of course I can cover the rent this month," she was saying. "I know you're having a hard time. I'll figure something out." After she hung up, I saw her putting items back on the shelves. Meat, vegetables, things she obviously needed. She was choosing between feeding herself and helping someone else, probably an adult child who had learned to see her as a solution to their problems rather than a person with her own needs. I almost walked away. It wasn't my business after all. But then I thought about the woman I used to be, about how desperately I had needed someone to show me a different way. "Excuse me," I said gently. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I couldn't help overhearing. Are you okay?" She looked embarrassed, the way I used to look when caught in the middle of my own dysfunction. "Oh, it's fine," she said quickly. "Just a little family emergency. Nothing I can't handle." I recognized the script, the automatic deflection, the way we minimize our own sacrifices to avoid acknowledging the pattern. "How many family emergencies have there been this year?" I asked softly. Her face crumpled, and I knew I had guessed correctly. "I don't know what else to do," she whispered. "She's my daughter. I can't just let her be evicted." "But you can let yourself go without food?" She stared at me, probably wondering why a stranger was asking such personal questions. "I've been where you are," I said. "I spent years funding other people's poor choices at the expense of my own well-being. I told myself it was love, but love doesn't leave you empty and forgotten." We talked for 20 minutes in that grocery store aisle, two older women sharing hard truths about family manipulation and the difference between helping and enabling. I told her my story, not all of it, but enough to let her know she wasn't alone. I gave her Dr. Rodriguez's number and the address of the community center where I had found my support group. I don't know if she'll call, if she'll make the changes she needs to make. But I know that sometimes all it takes is one person telling you that you deserve better, that you have the right to say no, that your worth isn't determined by your willingness to be used. That conversation reminded me why I share my story, why I'm telling it to you now. Somewhere out there is someone who recognizes themselves in my experience, someone who thinks that buying love is the only kind of love available to them, someone who has made themselves so small they've almost disappeared entirely. If that someone is you, please hear this. You deserve better. You deserve to be seen, valued, respected. You deserve relationships that lift you up instead of draining you dry. You deserve to say no without guilt, to have boundaries without apology, to take up space in your own life. It's never too late to demand better treatment. It's never too late to rediscover who you are when you're not trying to please everyone else. It's never too late to teach people how to love you properly. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept loveless treatment. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for your family is to demand that they rise to meet your standards, instead of constantly lowering your standards to meet their behavior. Standing up for yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. It's the only way to create space for authentic love to grow. It's the only way to model healthy relationships for the next generation. It's the only way to live with dignity in your own life. The wedding toast that was supposed to ruin everything actually saved everything worth saving. By refusing to stay invisible, I became visible not just to my family, but to myself. By demanding respect, I created a family culture where respect was possible. I think about that night often, about the moment I raised my glass and chose truth over peace, dignity over convenience. It was terrifying and liberating and necessary all at once. It was the moment I stopped being a ghost in my own life and started being the protagonist of my own story. Looking back now, I understand that the whispered warning, "Don't ruin this for us," was actually an invitation. An invitation to finally speak my truth, to finally claim my space, to finally love myself enough to demand better. And I'm so grateful I accepted that invitation. Today, when little Margaret Rose looks at me, she sees a woman who values herself, who travels and creates art and speaks her mind. She'll grow up knowing that love means respect, that family means showing up for each other, that no one should ever have to disappear to make others comfortable. That's the legacy I want to leave. Not money or material things, but the knowledge that every person has worth, that every voice deserves to be heard, that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever wondered if you're being loved or just being used? Have you ever whispered yes when everything inside you wanted to scream no? Your story matters. Your voice deserves to be heard. Your presence deserves to be celebrated, not managed. If this story resonates with you, if you see yourself in my journey, please share it. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and most importantly, start your own journey toward demanding the respect you deserve. Because somewhere out there is someone who needs to hear that it's possible to go from invisible to invaluable, from forgotten to flourishing, from ghost to protagonist, and that someone might be you. But let me tell you about what happened in the months that followed, because the transformation didn't happen overnight. Recovery from decades of emotional manipulation is like rehabilitation after a serious accident. It takes time, patience, and constant vigilance against falling back into old patterns. 3 months after the wedding, on a particularly cold February morning, I received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Chen from next door knocked on my door, holding a steaming cup of tea and wearing that concerned expression I had grown to cherish. "Margaret," she said in her careful English, "you look different." Happy different. We sat together at my tiny kitchen table, the same table where I had once spread out medical bills I couldn't afford and donation requests from children who barely knew me. But now it was cleared except for one of my paintings, a watercolor of Central Park in autumn that I had completed in art class the week before. "I've been watching you," Mrs. Chen continued, "since that night you came home from the wedding. You walk different now. Taller." She was right. I had been walking taller, literally and figuratively. The shame that had bent my shoulders for years was gone, replaced by something I hadn't felt in decades: pride in myself. "Mrs. Chen," I said, reaching across to touch her weathered hand, "do you think it's ever too late to start over?" She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Margaret, I came to America at 65 with 2 suitcases and 3 words of English. Every day is starting over if you choose it to be." Her wisdom reminded me of something I had forgotten in all those years of trying to earn love. Everyone is always becoming, always changing, always capable of choosing a different path. Even at 74, I was still becoming the woman I was meant to be. That conversation with Mrs. Chen marked the beginning of an unexpected friendship. We started taking walks together in the mornings, 2 elderly women navigating the sidewalks of Manhattan and sharing stories of the lives we had built from scratch. She told me about her husband's death, about the children who lived too far away to visit often, about the loneliness that had nearly consumed her until she learned to find joy in small daily pleasures. The way morning light hit her windowsill, the satisfaction of cooking a perfect soup for one, the pleasure of a good book on a quiet afternoon. I realized that she had somehow solved the puzzle that had tormented me for years: how to live a full life without constantly needing validation from others. She had learned what I was only beginning to understand: that the most reliable source of love has to come from within. Through Mrs. Chen, I also met other women in our building and neighborhood, women whose stories echoed mine in surprising ways. There was Dorothy from 3B, whose adult son had moved back home 3 times in 5 years, each time promising it would be temporary while he got back on his feet. There was Patricia from the first floor, who had spent her entire retirement fund helping her gambling-addicted daughter. There was Ruth from across the street, whose family only called when they needed a babysitter or a loan. We started meeting for coffee every Tuesday at a little diner on 3rd Avenue, 5 women whose children had learned to see us as resources rather than people. But instead of commiserating about our mistreatment, we did something different. We started talking about what we wanted for ourselves. Dorothy wanted to learn to play the piano. She had always dreamed of it but never had time when she was working and raising children. Patricia wanted to travel to Ireland, the homeland she had never seen. Ruth wanted to write a book about her experiences as a nurse during the early days of the AIDS crisis. Mrs. Chen wanted to learn to drive. At 80, she was tired of depending on others for transportation. And me? I wanted to teach again. Not in a traditional classroom. Those days were behind me. But I wanted to share knowledge, to feel useful in a way that fed my soul instead of draining it. I wanted to matter because of what I knew and who I was, not because of what I could give. Through the community center where I took art classes, I learned about a literacy program for adult immigrants. They needed volunteer tutors to help people learn English, to navigate the complexities of American bureaucracy, to build the communication skills that would help them create new lives in a foreign country. The first time I walked into that classroom, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, belonging based on competence rather than compliance. These students didn't care how much money I had or what I could do for them materially. They cared about what I could teach them, how I could help them understand the subtleties of English grammar and American culture. There was Hassan, a Syrian refugee who had been an engineer in his home country, but was working in a restaurant kitchen while he tried to get his credentials recognized. There was Maria, a housekeeper from Guatemala who cleaned office buildings at night and came to my classes during the day, determined to learn enough English to help her children with their homework. There was Giuseppe, an elderly Italian man whose wife had always handled all their English language interactions until she passed away, leaving him isolated by his inability to communicate with doctors and bureaucrats. These students reminded me why I had become a teacher in the first place. It wasn't about the paycheck or the summers off. It was about the moment when understanding dawns in someone's eyes, when a concept clicks into place, when you realize you've helped someone build a bridge between where they are and where they want to be. Hassan started calling me Professor Margaret, a title that made me stand a little taller each time I heard it. Maria brought me homemade tamales to show her appreciation for the extra time I spent helping her practice pronunciation. Giuseppe insisted on teaching me Italian phrases in exchange for English lessons, turning our tutorial sessions into cultural exchanges that enriched us both. For the first time in years, I was giving from a place of abundance rather than depletion. These students didn't take my knowledge for granted or treat my time as if it had no value. They understood that what I was offering them was precious, not because it cost me money, but because it represented years of experience and expertise. The literacy program also connected me with other volunteer teachers, people who shared my passion for education and my belief in the transformative power of knowledge. There was Professor Williams, a retired history teacher from Colombia, who tutored students preparing for their citizenship tests. There was Dr. Martinez, a former medical school professor who helped healthcare workers from other countries navigate American medical terminology. There was Ms. Johnson, a retired librarian who taught computer literacy to seniors who wanted to stay connected with family members online. These people knew me as Margaret the educator, Margaret the mentor, Margaret the woman who could conjugate irregular verbs and explain the Electoral College and help someone understand why Americans say, "How are you?" without expecting a detailed answer. They saw value in my mind, not just my wallet. 6 months after the wedding, Jake called with news that surprised me. "Grandma, I've been thinking about what you said at the wedding, about standing up for what's right, and I've been thinking about Mom and Dad." I held my breath, not sure where this conversation was heading. "I think I need to stop letting them pay for my college," he said quietly. "Jake, sweetheart, why would you do that?" "Because it's not really their money, is it? I mean, it used to be your money, and now it's student loans that Dad is taking out against their house that's probably still not really paid for because of all the other loans they took out when you were helping them." The maturity in his voice amazed me. At 19, he was seeing patterns that had taken me decades to recognize. "I got a job at the campus tutoring center," he continued, "and I'm going to apply for need-based financial aid. I want to pay my own way, even if it means I graduate with debt. I want to know that my education belongs to me, that I earned it myself." Tears came to my eyes as I listened to this young man choosing integrity over convenience, independence over dependency. "Jake, I'm so proud of you. But are you sure? College is expensive, and debt can be overwhelming." "I'm sure, Grandma. You taught me something important when you stood up at that wedding. You taught me that self-respect is worth more than money. And I can't respect myself if I'm living off money that was basically stolen from you. That phone call marked another turning point in our family's healing process. Jake's decision to pay his own way through school forced his parents to confront some uncomfortable truths about their finances and their responsibility for their children's futures. It also set an example for Emma, who started making different choices about how she and David managed their money. But perhaps most importantly, it showed me that my moment of rebellion at the wedding had planted seeds I hadn't even known were there. By standing up for myself, I had inadvertently taught my grandchildren to stand up for themselves and for what they believed was right. Still, the road to complete healing wasn't smooth. There were setbacks, moments when old patterns reasserted themselves with surprising strength. One evening in late spring, Linda called in crisis mode. Mike had been in a car accident. Not serious, but his truck was totaled and he couldn't work without it. Their insurance had lapsed because they were behind on payments. They needed money immediately to buy another vehicle, or Mike's fledgling business would collapse. "Mom, I know things have been difficult between us," Linda said, her voice shaking with tears and desperation. "But we don't have anywhere else to turn. We need $15,000 and we need it by Monday." For a moment, I felt the familiar pull of the old dynamic. My daughter was in crisis. My natural instinct was to fix it, to sacrifice whatever was necessary to solve her problem. I found myself mentally calculating how much money I had in savings, whether I could take out a loan against my small retirement account. But then I remembered Dr. Rodriguez's voice from one of our sessions. "Margaret, ask yourself this question. Are you being asked to help, or are you being recruited to enable? Is this request about solving a temporary problem, or is it about maintaining a pattern that keeps everyone stuck?" "Linda," I said carefully, "I can hear how frightened you are. This sounds like a really difficult situation." "It is. Mom, if Mike can't work, we could lose everything. The house, our credit, everything we've worked for. Tell me about the insurance lapse. What happened there?" There was a long pause. We got behind on payments. Things have been tight since you stopped. Since we had to start managing our money differently." "How far behind?" Another pause. 6 months. 6 months. They had been driving without insurance for 6 months, gambling with their family's safety and financial security, rather than making the hard choices necessary to live within their means. "Linda, I love you, but I can't give you $15,000 to buy Mike a truck." The explosion was immediate. "You can't, or you won't. Mom, this is an emergency. It's a crisis that came about because of choices you and Mike made. You chose to let your insurance lapse rather than adjust your lifestyle. You chose to gamble with your ability to work rather than make sacrifices in other areas. We couldn't afford the insurance. We're already living paycheck to paycheck. But you still have cable television. You still go out to dinner twice a week. Emma told me you just bought new furniture for the living room." I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was simply stating the facts that Linda couldn't see, because she had never learned to distinguish between needs and wants, between emergencies and consequences. "Those are small things, Mom. This is Mike's livelihood." And his livelihood depended on having insurance, which is why responsible business owners make that a priority over furniture and restaurants. The conversation devolved from there. Linda accused me of being heartless, of abandoning my family in their time of need, of caring more about money than about her happiness. She reminded me of every sacrifice she claimed to have made as my daughter, every inconvenience my presence in their lives had caused. I listened to it all, this familiar symphony of guilt and manipulation, and realized something remarkable. It didn't work anymore. The old buttons she was pushing had been permanently disconnected. When she finally ran out of accusations and hung up on me, I sat in my quiet apartment and waited for the crushing guilt that would have followed such a conversation in the past. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt sad. Sad that my daughter was in crisis. Sad that she hadn't learned better coping skills. Sad that our relationship was still so fragile. But I didn't feel responsible for fixing her problems. That night, I called Dr. Rodriguez's emergency line. "Margaret, what's going on?" I told her about Linda's call, about the pressure to provide money I didn't have for problems I didn't create. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Honestly, relieved, sad, but relieved. I think this might be the first time in my life that someone in my family has asked me for money, And I actually felt okay saying no. That's huge progress, Margaret. What do you think made the difference this time? I thought about it. I think I finally understand the difference between being needed and being used. My students at the literacy program need me. They need my knowledge, my patience, my encouragement. But they don't use me. They appreciate what I give them. They respect my time, and they give something back. What Linda was asking for, that wasn't need. That was just continuation of a pattern that was never really about love. Dr. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. Margaret, do you realize how far you've come? A year ago, you would have found a way to give Linda that money, even if it meant putting yourself at risk financially. Tonight, you recognized a manipulative pattern and chose not to participate in it. That's not just progress. That's transformation. She was right. The woman who had torn up a $5,000 check at Emma's wedding had been acting on impulse, on years of pent-up frustration and pain. But the woman who calmly refused to enable Linda's crisis was acting from a place of wisdom and self-respect that had been carefully cultivated over months of therapy and self-discovery. The next morning brought an unexpected call from Mike. Margaret, we need to talk. His voice was different, less entitled, more humble than I had ever heard it. Of course, Mike. How are you feeling after the accident? I'm fine, a little sore, but fine. Margaret, I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you about 100 apologies, but I'm starting with this one. I wasn't sure what to say, so I waited for him to continue. Linda called you last night asking for money to buy me a truck, and when you said no, she lost it completely. She spent the whole night ranting about how selfish you've become, how you've changed, how you don't care about family anymore. Mike, let me finish. I listened to her for about an hour, and then I told her to stop. I told her she was wrong, that you weren't the selfish one in this situation. We were. This was not the conversation I had expected. The truth is, Margaret, we've been living off borrowed money and borrowed time for years. Your money, the bank's money, credit card company's money. We never learned to live within our means because we always had you as a backup plan. And that wasn't fair to you. That wasn't love. That was exploitation. I found myself crying, not from sadness, but from relief. Someone in my family was finally seeing the truth clearly. I went to a bankruptcy attorney this morning, he continued. And I'm meeting with a credit counselor this afternoon. Linda thinks I'm crazy, but I'm tired of living this way. I'm tired of being the kind of man who lets his wife call her elderly mother begging for money. I want to be better than that. Mike, I'm so proud of you for taking those steps. That takes real courage. It's long overdue. And Margaret, I want you to know that Linda's anger, her accusations about you being selfish, that's not about you. That's about her being terrified of having to face reality without a safety net. She'll come around eventually, but it might take some time. That conversation with Mike marked the beginning of a shift in my relationship with Linda and her family. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't easy, but slowly they began to take responsibility for their own lives and choices. Mike did file for bankruptcy, and they did lose the house in Westchester. But instead of seeing it as a catastrophe, they eventually came to view it as liberation from a lifestyle they couldn't afford. They moved to a smaller apartment in Queens, closer to where Mike's construction work was more plentiful. Linda found a part-time job at a local school, something she had talked about wanting to do for years but had never pursued because she hadn't needed to work. With less financial pressure and more honest communication, their marriage actually began to improve. Without the constant stress of keeping up appearances and managing debt, they rediscovered things they liked about each other. Linda started cooking again, something she had enjoyed before they could afford to eat out regularly. Mike started coaching Jake's old Little League team, reconnecting with a community involvement that had fallen by the wayside during their financial troubles. Most importantly, they started talking to their children differently about money, work, and responsibility. Instead of treating financial problems as emergencies that someone else should solve, they began modeling problem-solving, budgeting, and living within their means. But the most profound change was in how they related to me. For the first time in years, when Linda called, it wasn't because she needed something. Sometimes she just wanted to talk, to share a funny story about her new job or ask my advice about dealing with difficult coworkers. Mike started including me in conversations about his business plans, asking for my perspective not because he expected me to fund his ideas, but because he valued my opinion. They began to see me as a person with wisdom and experience worth seeking, rather than just a bank account with emotions attached. A year and a half after the wedding, I received a phone call that brought my journey full circle in an unexpected way. "Mrs. Wilson, this is Jennifer Martinez from Lincoln High School. I'm calling because we're organizing a reunion for teachers who worked at Lincoln during the 1980s and 90s. Your name came up repeatedly as someone who made a significant impact on students during those years." Lincoln High School. I hadn't thought about that place in years, but suddenly I could smell the hallway disinfectant and hear the sound of locker doors slamming between classes. "We're having a gathering next month, and we'd love for you to be our keynote speaker. We wanted someone to talk about the lasting impact of education, about how teachers shape lives in ways they might never know." Me, a keynote speaker? The woman who had felt invisible for so many years was being asked to stand in front of an auditorium and share her wisdom? "I'm very flattered," I said, "but I'm not sure I'm the right person for that. I've been retired for quite a while." "Mrs. Wilson, you might not realize this, but we've been in touch with dozens of your former students while planning this event. The stories they tell about you, about how you changed their lives, about the confidence you gave them. You were clearly an extraordinary teacher." Former students? People remembered me after all these years? For example, there's Dr. James Patterson. He's an emergency room physician now, but he was Jimmy Patterson in your remedial English class in 1987. He credits you with teaching him that being a slow reader didn't mean he wasn't smart. He says you were the first teacher who saw his potential instead of his deficits. Jimmy Patterson. I remembered him. A kid everyone had written off, but who had this incredible ability to think through complex problems if you gave him time and didn't make him feel stupid. And there's Maria Santos. She's a federal judge now. She says you were the one who encouraged her to apply for college, who helped her write her application essays, who told her that her voice mattered. She wants to introduce you at the reunion. Maria Santos. A tiny girl with huge eyes who had been convinced she wasn't college material because no one in her family had ever gone beyond high school. I remembered staying after school with her, helping her see that her immigrant family's struggles weren't limitations, but strengths that college admissions committees would value. Mrs. Wilson, there are dozens of stories like these. Teachers who touched hundreds of lives, who changed trajectories, who saw potential where others saw problems. We think other educators need to hear about the long-term impact of what we do. By the time I hung up from that call, I was crying. Happy tears, grateful tears, tears of recognition. For so many years, I had measured my worth by how much money I could provide to my family, by how much I could sacrifice, by how small I could make myself to accommodate other people's needs. But these former students remembered me not for what I had given them materially, but for how I had seen them. They remembered me for believing in them, for refusing to accept their own limited vision of themselves, for insisting that they were capable of more than they imagined. This was the impact I had been hoping to make all along, not through my bank account, but through my mind and heart and experience. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing for that speech, thinking about the themes I wanted to address. I decided to talk about the difference between being needed and being used, about the importance of seeing people's potential rather than their deficits, about the long-term impact of treating people with dignity and respect. But mostly I wanted to talk about visibility, about how critical it is to really see the people in front of us, whether they're students or children or elderly parents. To see them as whole people with dreams and fears and potential, not just as problems to be solved or resources to be tapped. The night of the reunion, I stood backstage at Lincoln High School's auditorium, wearing a dress I had bought for myself. Blue again, but a brighter, more confident blue than the one I had worn to Emma's wedding, and listened to Maria Santos introduce me. "Margaret Wilson," she said to the audience of teachers, former students, and community members, taught me that intelligence comes in many forms, that potential doesn't always look like what we expect, and that believing in someone can literally change the direction of their entire life. She saw gifts in me that I couldn't see in myself, and she refused to let me settle for less than I was capable of achieving. As I walked onto that stage and looked out at the faces in the audience, some vaguely familiar from my teaching days, others completely new but all interested in what I had to say, I felt something I had been searching for my entire life. The knowledge that I mattered because of who I was, not what I could provide. I talked about the responsibility we all have to really see each other, to look past surface presentations and find the humanity underneath. I talked about the difference between helping people grow and enabling them to stay stuck. I talked about the courage it takes to demand better treatment, both for ourselves and from ourselves. But mostly, I talked about visibility, about the moral obligation to refuse to let people disappear, whether they're struggling students or aging parents or anyone else society tends to overlook. Every person in this room has the power to make someone else feel seen, I said. Every interaction is an opportunity to lift someone up or let them fade away. Choose to see, choose to believe in potential, choose to insist on dignity. The ripple effects of those choices can last for decades. After my speech, something magical happened. Former students lined up to talk to me, sharing stories of how something I had said or done had changed their path. Teachers came up to tell me how my words had reminded them why they entered education in the first place. Parents thanked me for inspiring them to see their children differently. But the encounter that moved me most was with a woman about Emma's age who approached me near the end of the evening. "Mrs. Wilson, I wasn't your student, but I wanted to thank you for what you said tonight." "Oh, you're welcome, dear. What resonated with you?" "The part about not disappearing to make other people comfortable. I've been supporting my parents financially for years, and I realized tonight that I've been making myself smaller and smaller to avoid confronting the fact that they're taking advantage of me. Your speech made me realize that I have the right to be seen as more than just a solution to their financial problems." As I looked at this young woman, I saw myself at her age, eager to please, afraid of conflict, convinced that love meant giving until it hurt. But she was learning these lessons decades earlier than I had, which meant she could build a different kind of life for herself. "You deserve relationships that celebrate you, not just use you," I told her. "It's never too late to teach people to treat you better, but it's also never too early." Driving home from the reunion that night in a taxi through the streets of Manhattan, I reflected on the incredible journey that had brought me from feeling invisible to feeling genuinely essential. Not essential because people needed me to solve their problems or fund their choices, but essential because I had something valuable to contribute to the world. My experience, my wisdom, my refusal to let people settle for less than they deserved. The following week, I got a call from the principal at Lincoln High School. "Mrs. Wilson, we've had such positive feedback from your speech. I wonder if you'd be interested in coming back to do some substitute teaching. We're particularly looking for someone to work with our English language learners and students who are struggling with reading." Substitute teaching. Going back into the classroom after all these years, not as someone begging to be needed, but as someone whose expertise was genuinely valued. "I'd love that," I said without hesitation. And so, at 74, I found myself back in a high school classroom, working with students who reminded me every day why I had become a teacher in the first place. These kids needed me not because I could solve their problems with money, but because I could help them solve problems with knowledge, patience, and belief in their potential. There was Carlos, a recent immigrant from Honduras who was brilliant in mathematics but couldn't pass English class because no one had taken the time to understand that his struggles weren't academic, but linguistic. There was Ashley, a teen mom who was ready to drop out because she couldn't see how education could fit into her complicated life. There was David, a kid with dyslexia who had been labeled slow by previous teachers, but who had incredible insights when given alternative ways to demonstrate his understanding. These students reminded me daily that the most important thing you can give someone is not money, but recognition. Recognition of their worth, their potential, their right to be seen and valued for who they are. Working with them also reinforced everything I had learned about healthy relationships. These kids needed my help, but they also respected my time and expertise. They were grateful for what I offered without being entitled to it. They understood that learning was a partnership, not a one-way transaction. Meanwhile, my family relationships continued to evolve and strengthen. Emma and David's daughter, Margaret Rose, was now 2 years old, a bright, curious toddler who knew her great-grandmother as someone who painted pictures and told stories and took her to museums. This little girl was growing up in a family where love flowed freely in all directions, where people were valued for who they were rather than what they could provide. Jake graduated from college debt-free, having worked his way through school with a combination of jobs, scholarships, and careful budgeting. The pride on his face at graduation was different from the pride I might have felt if I had simply paid his way. This was the pride of genuine accomplishment, of knowing that he had earned every step of his success. Linda and Mike's marriage was stronger than it had been in years. Learning to live within their means had forced them to rediscover simple pleasures they had forgotten. Cooking together, taking walks, playing board games instead of going out to expensive entertainment. Their relationship was more honest now, built on shared responsibility rather than shared denial. Most importantly, Linda had finally learned to see me as a person rather than a resource. Our weekly lunches had become genuine conversations between two adults who respected each other. She told me about her job, her dreams for the future, her concerns about the kids. I shared stories from my teaching, my travels, my art classes. We had become friends in a way that I had never imagined possible with my own daughter. On the second anniversary of Emma's wedding, my family threw me a surprise party. Not because they needed something from me, not because obligation demanded it, but because they genuinely wanted to celebrate the woman I had become. The party was at Emma and David's apartment, the same place where we had shared that transformative Christmas dinner. But this time, the celebration was all about me. My return to teaching, my artwork, my travels, my friendships, my courage in standing up for myself. Emma had created another photo album, but this one was different from the wedding album that had excluded me. This album was titled Grammy Margaret's New Adventure, and it chronicled the past 2 years of my life. Pictures of me with my art class, photos from my weekend trips, snapshots of me with my literacy students, images of me speaking at the teacher reunion. "Look at this woman," Emma said as we flipped through the pages together. "Look how happy she is. Look how much she's living." She was right. The woman in these photos was living, not just existing. She was engaged with the world, contributing to it, taking up space in it without apology. Jake had written me a letter for the occasion, which he read aloud to the gathering. "Dear Grandma Margaret, 2 years ago you did something that shocked our entire family. You stood up for yourself. You refused to be invisible. You demanded better treatment. At the time, I'll be honest, it felt scary and disruptive. We didn't understand what you were doing or why you were doing it. But now I see that you were saving us. You were saving yourself from a life of being used and forgotten, but you were also saving us from being the kind of people who use and forget the people who love them most. You taught us that love isn't about taking everything someone is willing to give. Love is about treasuring what someone freely offers. Thank you for teaching us how to love better. Thank you for showing us what strength looks like. Thank you for refusing to disappear." Linda's gift to me was perhaps the most meaningful of all. It was a small framed quote that she had written in her own handwriting. "You can't change how people treat you, but you can change how you respond to how they treat you. Thank you for teaching us this lesson, even when it was hard for all of us to learn. With love and respect, Linda." That evening, as I looked around the room at my family, truly my family now, not just people related to me by blood, but people who chose to love me properly, I realized that my moment of rebellion at Emma's wedding hadn't destroyed anything worth keeping. It had cleared away the dysfunction and created space for something beautiful to grow. But perhaps the most profound moment of the evening came when little Margaret Rose climbed into my lap and asked me to tell her a story. "What kind of story would you like, sweetheart?" "Tell me about the time you were brave, Grammy." I looked at this little girl, this child who would grow up knowing that her great-grandmother was a woman of substance and dignity, and I realized that my story of standing up for myself had become part of our family's mythology. Not as a cautionary tale about what happens when you rock the boat, but as an inspiring story about what happens when you value yourself enough to demand better treatment. "Once upon a time," I began, "there was a grandmother who forgot how important she was. She gave and gave until she had nothing left to give, and she became so quiet that people forgot she was there. But one day, at a big celebration, she remembered her voice. And when she used that voice to speak her truth, something magical happened. Not only did she become visible again, but she helped everyone around her learn to love better." As Margaret Rose listened with wide eyes to this simplified version of my journey, I realized that this was the legacy I wanted to leave. Not money or material things, but the knowledge that every person has the right to be seen, valued, and treated with dignity. The evening ended with all of us gathered around Emma and David's small kitchen table, sharing dessert and conversation that flowed naturally from person to person. No one was ignored. No one was taking more than they gave. No one was being used. We were simply a family enjoying each other's company. As I rode home that night in a taxi through the familiar streets of Manhattan, I reflected on the incredible distance I had traveled from that bitter morning 2 years earlier when I had held Emma's wedding invitation and hoped desperately that my family still loved me. They did love me, it turned out. They had always loved me. But they had never learned to love me properly until I insisted on proper treatment. By refusing to accept less than I deserved, I had created space for genuine love to flourish. The city lights sparkled outside my taxi window, and I thought about all the other people out there who might be struggling with similar situations. Elderly parents being used by adult children, spouses being taken for granted, friends being exploited by people who saw them as resources rather than people. To all of them, I wanted to say this: you deserve better. You have the right to be seen, valued, and treated with respect. It's never too late to teach people how to love you properly. It's never too late to demand dignity. It's never too late to stop being invisible and start being essential. Not because people need you to solve their problems, but because you have something valuable to offer the world just by being authentically yourself. Your voice matters, your boundaries matter, your presence matters. Stand up. Speak up. Show up as yourself, fully and without apology. The people who truly love you will rise to meet your standards. And the people who won't? Well, they'll teach you something valuable about the difference between being loved and being used. Choose to be loved. Choose to be seen. Choose to matter. Because you do matter. You always have. Sometimes it just takes one moment of courage, one raised glass, one spoken truth, one refusal to disappear, to transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. Your moment is waiting. What will you do when it arrives?